So just to kick off and to introduce myself, my name is Darragh O'Brien. I'm the Managing Director of Castlebridge. We're a data governance and data strategy consulting company with expertise in data protection and helping organizations figure out how to think about how to use data and how to use tools and technologies for gathering data like drones and drone-mounted sensors in an appropriate way that manages compliance obligations and things like that. So we were asked to participate in this project to work with Smart Dublin to develop a handbook for how to think about data protection issues in the context of various use cases and scenarios for using drones. So the agenda for today is very simple. We're going to start by introducing the handbook, give you an overview of the structure of the handbook, what's in it, what it's intended to do, and how it's intended that you would use it. We're going to introduce some of the concepts from the handbook. They're going to talk about how they can be applied, and then we're going to do some questions and answers. So the recording is going to stop before we get to the questions and answers bit. So when people are asking questions, please feel free to ask openly. There will be nothing recorded. The downside is there won't be a recording necessarily of the answers either, but I will be making notes as we go along, and anything that needs to be flagged back and communicated back, I'm sure we'll be able to get that taken care of as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is to help you understand the handbook and what it is designed for. So the handbook is a very straightforward document. The key challenge in designing a handbook for data protection for the use of drones and drone-mounted sensors is that the technology and technical capabilities are evolving phenomenally rapidly in terms of what we can do with these wonderful little devices and these wonderful big devices for some of the larger scale ones. And as a result, it's very difficult to write a handbook that is definitive, that is the be-all and end-all of all things to do with drones. What we identified with this handbook was that we needed to look at the scenarios where local authorities and public bodies are considering using drones. We wanted to identify what those scenarios were, categorize them, and then start identifying how that could be used to build a framework that would enable local authorities, public bodies, and other stakeholders to work together to build the required knowledge base and the required guidance, guidelines, methods, and practices for each possible use of drones into the future. So the handbook breaks down to three key parts. The first part is some background information on drones and data protection as it applies to the way in which drone-mounted sensors will work. And I'm using the phrase drone-mounted sensors because when we talk about a drone, it's a platform. And we can attach lots of different types of sensor to that platform for lots of different purposes. It's not just cameras, it's not just thermal imaging. There's a whole host of other things you can do with these wonderful little objects. And in that context, each of those different technologies raises potential different data protection issues and challenges for organizations that are using or are seeking to adopt and implement drones and drone-mounted sensor technologies. So part one identifies some core basic principles that we need to be considering in our use of drones. Part two looks at putting those principles into practice, and then part three looks at some best practice recommendations based on what we learned, based on the issues and challenges that stakeholders we interviewed were sharing with us. We made some recommendations for how to approach this in a strategic way, as opposed to coming from the bottom up and looking at each individual scenario for use on its own. We made some recommendations for how to take this in a strategic, structured way and build forward with some certain key recommendations of what can be done and what should be done to help improve the reliability and the ways of working around data protection and drone use in local government. So looking at the background and principles, some key points that we have in the background is that data and data gathering and data, the use of data obtained from drones, much like all data, has essentially a three-step life cycle where we acquire the information, we analyze the information, we take action based on that information. So when we're looking at a scenario for the use of a drone-mounted sensor, we need to be considering what information are we looking to acquire, what questions are we looking to answer with that information and over what time scale, and what action are we going to take based on that information that we're getting. So whether we're recording video for later analysis, whether we're integrating machine learning technologies or analytics technologies to look at data gathered from optical sensors or LiDAR or other types of sensors, or whether we're doing in the field live viewing of video to then inform a decision on the ground. These basic steps in this life cycle of acquiring the information, analyzing the information, and then taking an action based on the information are the things we want to be focusing on as when we think about what we're going to use drones and drone-mounted sensors for. From those three-step life cycle, the 3 steps of that life cycle, we then have 4 key decision points that we need to be thinking about when we're planning and considering using drone-mounted sensors. The first step will be to ask, do we have data about people? Second step, we're looking at issues and risks. Third step is privacy impact assessment. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on because that's one of the methodology elements we touched on. And in the recommendation section, there are 10 recommendations covering an array of aspects of the use of drones. And out of the interviews we did, we've identified 50 scenarios, over 50 scenarios for the use of drones across different areas of local government function. And what we developed is a taxonomy, a hierarchy, a structure of use cases. So as new scenarios arise, what needs to be done is to say, well, is this the same as something we're doing already? And what is different or what is the same from a data protection issues and risk perspective, so that we can promote reuse of data protection impact assessments and promote the development of standard operating procedures and good practices across all possible uses and scenarios for the deployment of drones and drone-related technologies in public sector organizations. Now, just to manage everyone's expectation, the handbook doesn't provide all the answers, but it hopefully will help you ask better questions in a consistent way, and it has some pointers in it about how you can develop this further as a living resource. This should be seen not as the definitive product, but as the starting point for a shared resource for local government stakeholders to develop a robust framework to assist the data protection impact assessment and planning of for the deployment of any sort of drone-related technologies. So, when we look at the background and context section of the report, of the handbook, we look at a number of key things. We look at state of the art in drone use and data protection. We looked at the types of technologies. We looked at the types of regulation and the issues that arise. We look at the types of issues that arise from a data protection perspective in relation to the use of drones. We also consider the issues of drones and covert surveillance, which is a particularly problematic area. We looked at use cases and usage scenarios, and we start the development of a taxonomy of use cases, and then we start building out some guidance on the importance of that taxonomy. So one of the key things in relation to drones and the use of drones and drone use cases is that the magic pyramid, the triangle of the technical capability of the avionics technology, the actual airframes of drones, the battery technology, and the sensor and data communications technologies that can be mounted on drones, combined with data processing and analytics technologies landside, that not on the device itself, but secondary processing using machine learning and other technologies, means we have a phenomenal range of potential scenarios and use cases available to us in terms of the use of drones. And as we see advances in the avionics capabilities, as we see advances in battery technology, and as we see improvements, continuing improvements in the capabilities of the different sensors, and most importantly, a reduction in the cost of some of these things, the various use cases we might have will evolve over time. Mitka Amorostos identified 5 key categories of use case for the use of drones in research they did back in 2017. Emergency services use, infrastructure monitoring and inspection, environment, earth sciences, and defense and security. So this was the starting point, looking to see what classification of use cases could we identify in the literature. Because in our interviews, we were finding lots of commonality and structures in terms of things people wanted to do. But one of the things we identified was there really wasn't a structure of use cases that actually looked at things from a strategic or macro level perspective for local authority and local government use cases for the use of drones. We also introduce and refresh people's understanding of the concept of data protection and privacy by design and by default, which is a fundamental requirement from a data protection perspective. One of the key things is ensuring that we take proactive and preventative steps to minimize the invasion on people's privacy and to minimize the intrusion on people's data protection rights, while trying to achieve a positive sum outcome for individuals and for the local authority or public sector bodies in their use of these technologies. But this is a fundamental life cycle we need to apply. How do we apply these principles? So in the handbook, we introduce these principles and we talk about them in the context of drone usage scenarios and drone use cases, taking a little bit out of concept and trying to put it into some practical context. We introduce in this background section this life cycle. So this is a useful rule of thumb way of thinking about getting data and what you're doing with data. How are you acquiring it? What are you acquiring? What are the questions you're going to ask of it? And what actions are you going to take with that information once you have it? And at each step in this life cycle, data protection issues may arise. Issues and risks may need to be mitigated and managed. But by thinking about this in a structured way, what type of data are we getting? What type of sensor or device are we using to get this data? How are we going to use that data? And then what action are we going to take with it? It allows us to step back for a moment from the wonderful capability of the technology to ask, what are we using it for? And how is it going to add value? How is it going to be a benefit to the organization? And how are we going to minimize any invasiveness or impact on people's data protection rights and privacy rights arising from that? And this is the key challenge and opportunity for this type of handbook, this type of approach. What we're trying to achieve is a framework that lets us implement and execute drone operations in a way that's cost-effective, compliant, that is evidence-based, so you can demonstrate how you have done the evaluation and how you have identified that what you're doing falls into a particular scenario, and how you've identified the relevant issues and risks and compliance requirements in that scenario, and how you've then implemented that in a repeatable and scalable way. That doesn't mean you have to do a huge iterative data protection impact assessment every single time, but that you can identify very quickly from a reference library of DPIAs that have been done for scenarios, for use cases in the taxonomy, and that you're eventually working not from a green field, but identifying what's different in your scenario compared to what has been done before. So the secret sauce in this handbook, one of the things we identified that was really an accelerator for helping local government get to grips with this and enabling local authorities and associated stakeholder groups to collaborate and share good practices, was this idea of a taxonomy of use cases. So we identified 4 high-level use cases: monitoring and measurement, incident response and planning, investigation and enforcement, and media, publicity and entertainment as the 4 top level. use cases, and then going down the hierarchy, going down the taxonomy, we have environmental monitoring, population movement monitoring, built environment monitoring, survey and mapping, pre-incident planning, advanced monitoring, incident response, scene of crime response, or local authority function enforcement, media recordings, and event production. So all things we can begin to seed and develop the tree of scenarios that we will use drones and drone-mounted sensors for. This allows us to identify, as we get into, if you want to get into the detail, like we got into a lot of detail during the drafting, looking at, do we have to drill down to the different types of sensor, and does that change the nature of the taxonomy? And then we decided that was far too much nerding out on what tools and technologies are out there, and we needed to keep it simple. So we've tried to do is keep it simple. We're looking at the cluster of things, and the handbook is built around the idea of these use case scenarios and this taxonomy, so that at a point in time, with any use you're proposing to have, that you can identify what family of use case are you in, and what are the commonly occurring issues, risks, mitigations, etc., that you need to be considering at that time. So just to show you the spreadsheet that we developed of potential use cases, we did actually look out across various types of technology, and you can extend these use cases, you can extend the taxonomies based on new and emerging technologies, because this allows you to be flexible in your approach. And you can then start to look at, does the technology that you're deploying, does the type of sensor you're deploying, or does the combination of sensors that you're deploying in a particular application of drone-mounted technologies, does that change the calculus? Does that change the nature of the data protection issues and risks that you need to be mitigating, so you can ensure you have appropriate practical controls in place, as opposed to trying to boil the ocean to get to the perfect solution. Perfect is the enemy of the good. The taxonomy approach, I think we believe, is going to help local authorities get to good faster and eventually get to perfect. The key benefits are that this is a design principles-based approach. So we start not by looking at what the technology is and what we might want to use it for, but by turning it on the head and saying, well, what are the things we do, and what would we want to use these things for, and then how would we want to use that? So we go to the action, what do we want to do, analysis, what are the questions we want to ask and have answers to inform what we want to do, and then how do we acquire that information? The focus also moves from the instance of a use, so the specifics of, I'm going to put this particular drone in the air on this particular day with this particular type of camera on it, to the context of use. So what's the purpose? What type of sensors? What is the operating environment you're operating in? What are the issues and risks that you might need to consider around that? And it allows you to then build a family of those scenarios related to each other, branching off from each other, but it means that your DPIA becomes an iterative expansion on the taxonomy, dealing with the exceptions, not having to be started from scratch every single time. That means you can start building template DPIAs for a family of use cases. So if you have, for example, and the example we give in the handbook is enforcement, local authority enforcement functions, because Werla had done some fantastic work around environmental waste management enforcement. We put that into that taxonomy. We put that in as a scenario, and that means that any other enforcement function can look at that and say, what are we doing that's different? What are the questions that were asked here that we need to answer over here to make sure that we are building a best practice DPIA? Any new use case is an additional component, an additional element on the DPIA. You're not having to start from scratch, and it allows you to start building standardized templating and building libraries of DPIA. So if Dublin do something this month with a particular new technology as a pilot, next month, Kerry can simply go, we want to do that, and there is a document there in this scenario taxonomy that means we can reference that, and then we're simply looking at, is there a difference between deploying on O'Connell Street in Dublin and deploying in Clarny National Park? What's different in the environments in terms of standards, safeguards, etc. Now, taxonomies are really, really powerful. And as anyone who's ever been in the library and anyone here who's worked in libraries, hello, the Dewey Decimal Code system in the library lets you know what a book is about simply by looking at the first 3 digits. And then it's, where in the library that book is, and you more or less know what that book is going to be about before you've even picked it up. And that's why with the drone scenarios, we very strongly view that, and the strong recommendation is that building out that taxonomy of use cases is much more important and is a key enabler for building out DPIAs and building out a good, transparent, and scalable approach to deploying these types of technologies into the future. So when we talk about putting the principles into practice, we talk about a decision flow for drones and drone-mounted sensors. We talk about how the data protection principles can be applied in practice. One of the key issues there is how do you apply data protection by design and by default, where, as said by a couple of commenters on the document, vendors don't necessarily sell this as a feature. The key point there is if you ask for it as a feature, they will start to sell it. And the more people ask for it, the more you'll see the market beginning to move. But the 4 key decision points we're looking at here are, do you have to consider data protection issues at all? Are you doing something that's in an identified scenario, or is it something new? And do you need to consider a data protection impact assessment? What do you need to consider in that data protection impact assessment? And then how do you evaluate utility versus invasiveness? When it comes to mapping the data protection principles to the drone context, what we've done is we've taken each data protection principle and we have exploded it to see to discuss what that means in practice from the point of view of drones and drone use, so that you can put it in context, take it out of the theory and put it into some practical context for yourself as you're thinking about the use of drones and the use cases, etc. I've just picked 2 for the slideshow today. There are a number in the document as well, worth having a look at the document. The 4 key decision points we're looking at: do data protection or data privacy issues arise for your planned use of drones? If your drone simply has avionics sensors and collision detection sensors and isn't recording anything and doesn't have any optical sensors that might be capturing personal data or capturing people in any way, then you probably don't have an issue here. If it's a blind drone that's just using GPS and other sensors to avoid collisions, then less of an issue. Second question is, are you doing something that's already identified as a scenario? Well, if it's already identified as a scenario, there should be a DPIA there that you can pick up and reference. And then you're simply looking at what's different in your application. So you're not starting from scratch, you're able to build that knowledge up. And if you do need to do DPA, what do you need to put into that? And then what do you need to do to strike a balance between utility and invasive, and what can you do to make things more useful and less invasive? So these decision flows are in the document. So the first decision flow, understanding your purpose, understanding the type of sensor, understanding are you going to be logging or recording data that could identify people? Or could people be identified from an analysis of that data? And if the answer is no, all the way across, then you probably don't have a data protection issue. We can record you've done an assessment of that. Decision 2, checking to see, is there a use case already in existence? If this isn't something that's already in existence as a scenario, do a DPIA, update the library, keep going. If it is in existence already, check what safeguards did you put in place, check to make sure you've actually implemented them, document what you're doing, and then carry out an after action review to make sure that everything worked okay. And if it didn't work okay, if there were issues, updating the use case library, updating the DPIA, updating the standard operating procedures is part of a continuous improvement approach. This is one approach to doing a DPIA. It's in the handbook. I'm not going to dwell on it. But again, it starts with identifying what is it you're trying to do. What's the action you were trying to do, to achieve? What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? And then what information do you need to get that? And how are you getting that information? Finally, utility versus invasiveness. This is a framework we use in Castlebridge from an information ethics perspective. Key thing is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how useful is this processing going to be to society or to the local authority? And how invasive is it likely to be for the people who are walking around underneath this thing that's flying overhead? And what you need to do with this utility versus invasive matrix is to say, well, if it's very, very useful, but very, very invasive, what can we do? So if it's up here, what can we do to reduce the level of invasiveness so that we're striking a better balance? And it's simply a way of recording that thinking and recording that decision making. We discuss it in the handbook. Key recommendations we make in the handbook are listed here. Top of the list is this taxonomy of use cases and scenarios, because it allows you to structure your thinking and allows you to collaborate around a common structure, and it allows you to meet the second recommendation, which is to build a library of DPIAs around those identified use cases and scenarios, without not everyone going off individually as a separate organization or a separate team, but saying, well, we're working on this scenario as a team, as a network of local authorities. You can build a library of standard mitigations and controls, promoting reuse and sharing of knowledge. Fourth recommendation is to use the least invasive technology possible for your objective. And if you can't use a less invasive technology, understand what controls you're putting in place to mitigate and minimize the invasiveness factor. Fifth recommendation is for drones, and this is where the taxonomy of use cases comes in handy, updating the register of processing activities for the local authority to cover off the fact that you use these devices in these ways for these purposes, if there is personal data being captured. We talk about the life cycle of data and potentially any potential secondary uses. So whether collaborating on, and again, goes to one of the later points about reducing the number of drone operations by coordinating flights, improving coordination of drone operations so that you can deploy one drone with two sensors rather than two different drones on two different days, which reduces the potential impacts on individuals. It certainly reduces the sense of being surveilled all the time, which reduces the nervousness and concern that people would have. We need to improve transparency. This is a key one. For planned drone operations, I'm aware there is work going on in parts of DCC in particular on this. Where you've planned drone operations going on, publicizing the fact that a drone will be deployed, what it's being used for, and when it will be operating, and who could be contacted if people have queries about it, is a good way of showing people that you have nothing to hide about your use of these technologies. And having that taxonomy of use cases means you can be very clear, we're using this drone for these two purposes in our use case scenario, and here's a link to the DPIA we have for those scenarios. That's a vision of the future. From a transparency perspective, you're not dealing with individual easy-peasy use cases, you're dealing with a coherent view, and you can make things very transparent and communicate transparently in that way. Eighth recommendation, you're going to have to introduce statutory basis in some cases, so it's worth looking at those and identifying in those scenarios those use cases that will require a specific statutory basis to be developed. Because then you can just put a ring around those and say those ones require specific legislation to be enacted. Finally, our key recommendation out of this is to develop a code of conduct for drone operations. In data protection land, codes of conduct are an agreed minimum set of standards for the handling and processing of personal data, how things get done, which are agreed amongst an industry group or other group, subject to an oversight group, a monitoring body, but it allows the Data Protection Commission, rather than looking at each individual data controller separately, they will actually look at the compliance to the code of conduct, and they will look at that as a group. And if the code of conduct is complied with in the operation of a data processing activity, that is actually a significant mitigating factor in any investigation or any data protection enforcement action that might be taken. It also means that it's easier to identify rogue operators who aren't complying with the code, and then you need to have a way of sanctioning them. But what we found working with organizations, we're actually involved in 2 codes of conduct projects at the moment. The DPC really likes them. They really want them to be done, but they are looking to have them done with a degree of rigor so that they can be relied upon. And that taxonomy framework, the libraries of DPIAs, the libraries of standard mitigations and controls, brings you a significant step forward towards having the basis of a good, robust code of conduct. So finally, hats off to the guys in Werla. You developed a DPIA for local authority function enforcement. It was local authority waste enforcement function. We have a DPIA for that now, which any other waste enforcement function can look at and can refer to and learn from. And then you're simply looking at the context of use in different areas of the country and in different environments to see, do the controls and safeguards need to change for a specific application. Any other law enforcement, local authority enforcement function use case can look at what Werla have done for the waste management DPIA and then say, what's different? What else do we need to have? Are we clear on our legal basis? Are we clear on the operating environment? What's the same or similar? What safeguards are expected? What safeguards need to be added that aren't in the waste management context? And then write that up as a DPIA and codify the safeguards as an SOP. By recognizing that they're part of the same family of use cases, it accelerates the process of building a DPIA.